There are stories buried so deeply in time that even Scripture trembles at their name. Before doctrine shaped belief, before history chose what was sacred, there was a truth whispered through forgotten scrolls, a truth about the first woman humanity was taught to fear. They called her the first sinner. But what if Eve was the first keeper of divine knowledge? What if she carried secrets too powerful for kings, too dangerous for priests, too sacred for Scripture itself? Tonight you will witness the forbidden gospel that never reached the altar, the words they erased, the legacy they silenced, the revelation that could reshape everything we believe about creation, temptation, and the origin of humanity. This is not just her story. This is the truth they buried. And once you hear it, you will never see Eve the same again. In the shadowed halls of the Vatican secret archives, beneath layers of dust and centuries of deliberate silence, lies a collection of texts so dangerous that their very existence has been systematically erased from Christian memory. These are not mere historical curiosities or theological footnotes. They are forbidden gospels that challenge the foundation of organized religion itself, texts that painted a radically different picture of humanity's first woman and the true nature of divine knowledge. Among these suppressed writings stands one of the most controversial documents ever penned by early Christian sects. A gospel that dared to suggest that Eve, the woman blamed for humanity's fall, was actually its first prophet. A text so threatening to ecclesiastical authority that every known copy was ordered destroyed, its followers hunted down like heretics, and its very mention branded as blasphemy punishable by death. This is the story of the lost Gospel of Eve, a forbidden scripture that reveals humanity's first encounter with divine wisdom through the eyes of the woman who dared to seek knowledge beyond the boundaries set by her Creator. For over 16 centuries, the Church has worked tirelessly to ensure these revelations remained buried. Tonight, we uncover why they were so terrified of what Eve truly represented. The year was 367 AD. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria stood before his assembled clergy, clutching a letter that would forever alter the landscape of Christian faith. In his hands lay the 39th Festal Letter, a document that would canonize 27 books as the official New Testament, while condemning dozens of others as heretical fabrications. Among the texts marked for destruction were Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, and most dangerous of all, the Gospel of Eve. Athanasius understood what modern scholars are only beginning to grasp. These weren't simply alternative versions of familiar stories. They were revolutionary documents that presented an entirely different understanding of creation, salvation, and the role of divine feminine wisdom in humanity's spiritual journey. The Gospel of Eve, in particular, posed an existential threat to the patriarchal structure of the emerging Orthodox Church. The text portrayed Eve not as the naive woman deceived by a serpent, but as the first human to recognize the true nature of divine gnosis, the sacred knowledge that the Creator deity sought to withhold from humanity. According to this forbidden gospel, the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not Satan in disguise, but a messenger of the true God, offering Eve the wisdom necessary to transcend the material prison created by a jealous and lesser divine being known as the Demiurge. This radical reinterpretation turned the traditional narrative on its head. Where Orthodox Christianity taught that Eve's disobedience brought sin and death into the world, the Gospel of Eve proclaimed that her courage to seek forbidden knowledge was humanity's first step towards spiritual liberation. The fruit of the tree of knowledge was not humanity's downfall, but its salvation, and Eve was not the cause of mankind's exile from paradise, but the prophet who showed them the path to true enlightenment. The implications were staggering. If Eve was a prophet rather than a sinner, if the serpent was a divine messenger rather than Satan, if the God of the garden was a false deity rather than the true Creator, then the entire foundation of Christian theology crumbled. The Church's authority, built upon the doctrine of original sin and the necessity of salvation through Christ alone, became questionable at best. But the Gospel of Eve went further still. According to fragments preserved by early church fathers who quoted the text while condemning it, this forbidden scripture claimed that Eve received direct revelation from the divine feminine principle known as Sophia, or wisdom herself. In ecstatic visions, Eve was shown the true nature of reality, the cosmic hierarchy of divine beings, and the secret knowledge necessary for the soul's return to its heavenly origin. These revelations were not meant for Eve alone. The Gospel portrayed her as instructing Adam and their descendants in the hidden mysteries of existence. She became the first teacher of Gnosis, the original bearer of divine wisdom, and the mother of all who would seek knowledge beyond the constraints of orthodox religion. Her legacy was carried forward by a secret lineage of initiates who preserved her teachings through coded symbols, hidden rituals, and carefully guarded oral traditions. The early church fathers were horrified by these claims. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, condemned the Gospel of Eve as the product of deranged minds, claiming that its followers engaged in obscene rituals and blasphemous practices. Epiphanius of Salamis went further, describing the text as a demonic deception designed to lead the faithful astray through promises of secret knowledge and spiritual superiority. Their condemnations, however, reveal more than they intended. The very intensity of their attacks suggests that the Gospel of Eve was not merely an obscure heretical text, but a widely circulated document with significant influence among early Christian communities. The Church Fathers would not have devoted such extensive effort to refuting a minor sectarian writing. They were fighting a war for the soul of Christianity itself, and the Gospel of Eve represented one of their most formidable opponents. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century have provided tantalizing glimpses of what was lost when these texts were systematically destroyed. The Nag Hammadi Library, unearthed in Egypt in 1945, contained 52 Gnostic texts that had been hidden in earthenware jars for over 1,500 years. Among them were Gospels that echoed themes found in the suppressed Gospel of Eve, presenting alternative narratives of creation, salvation, and the role of divine feminine wisdom. The Gospel of Philip, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts, speaks of Sophia as the divine mother who gave birth to the material world through her desire to know the unknowable God. The Apocryphon of John describes the demiurge's creation of Adam and Eve as an attempt to trap divine sparks of light within material bodies. The Gospel of Mary portrays the Magdalene as a recipient of secret teachings that the male disciples struggled to accept. These surviving texts suggest that the Gospel of Eve was part of a larger tradition that viewed women as particularly suited to receive divine revelation. Unlike the Orthodox Church, which increasingly restricted women's roles in religious leadership, the Gnostic communities that preserved these forbidden Gospels often elevated women as teachers, prophets, and spiritual guides. Eve, as the first woman to receive divine gnosis, became their ultimate exemplar. The suppression of the Gospel of Eve was not merely a theological dispute, but a deliberate campaign to erase an entire understanding of human spirituality. The Church's victory was so complete that for centuries, scholars assumed that references to the text by early Church Fathers were describing a minor heretical writing of little historical significance. Only recently have researchers begun to recognize the profound implications of what was lost. Modern reconstructions of the Gospel of Eve, based on patristic quotations and comparative analysis of related Gnostic texts, reveal a sophisticated theological system that challenged every major doctrine of Orthodox Christianity. The text apparently taught that the material world was not God's good creation, but a prison constructed by ignorant and malevolent forces. Salvation came not through faith in Christ's sacrifice, but through the acquisition of secret knowledge that enabled the soul to escape its material bondage. Eve's role in this cosmic drama was central. As the first human to recognize the true nature of their imprisonment and the first to receive the knowledge necessary for liberation, she became the archetypal Gnostic redeemer. Her willingness to disobey the demiurge's prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge was not humanity's fall, but its first step toward divinity. The Gospel portrayed Eve's descendants as inheriting her capacity for divine revelation. Women, in particular, were seen as natural recipients of Sophia's wisdom, their very being reflecting the divine feminine principle that Orthodox Christianity had systematically suppressed. The text apparently contained detailed instructions for ritual practices designed to awaken this inherited gnosis, transforming ordinary believers into bearers of cosmic secrets. These teachings spread throughout the Mediterranean world in the first centuries of Christianity, finding particularly fertile ground among communities that felt marginalized by the increasingly institutionalized church. The Gospel of Eve became a rallying point for those who rejected the growing emphasis on clerical authority, orthodox doctrine, and masculine religious leadership. The response from church authorities was swift and merciless. Beginning in the 2nd century and intensifying after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, a systematic campaign was launched to eliminate every trace of the Gospel of Eve and similar texts. Manuscripts were burned, teachers were excommunicated, and followers were branded as heretics, subject to persecution and death. The suppression was so thorough that by the 5th century, the Gospel of Eve existed only in fragmentary quotations preserved by its enemies. Even these hostile witnesses reveal enough to understand why the text was considered so dangerous. Here was a scripture that not only challenged orthodox doctrine, but offered an alternative path to salvation that bypassed the church entirely. The few surviving fragments hint at revelations so profound that their discovery would have shaken the foundations of medieval Christianity. According to Epiphanius, the Gospel contained Eve's own account of her encounter with the divine, describing visions of cosmic hierarchies, secret names of power, and rituals for ascending through the heavenly spheres. As the Gospel described rituals of such power and complexity that their very performance was said to tear the veil between the material and divine realms. Eve, according to these forbidden passages, had learned to commune directly with Sophia through sacred ceremonies involving mirrors, serpent imagery, and invocations of the hidden names of God. These practices were passed down through generations of initiated women, creating an underground network of mystics who challenged the church's monopoly on divine revelation. What terrified church authorities most was not merely the theological content of these teachings, but their practical implications. The Gospel of Eve presented a form of spirituality that required no priests, no institutional hierarchy, and no masculine mediation between the believer and the divine. Women who embraced these teachings could claim direct access to God through their connection to Eve's prophetic legacy, effectively bypassing centuries of carefully constructed ecclesiastical control. The text apparently contained detailed accounts of Eve's mystical experiences following her exile from Eden. Rather than depicting her as a penitent sinner mourning her disobedience, the Gospel portrayed her as a triumphant initiate who had successfully stolen divine fire for humanity. Her conversations with Sophia revealed the true nature of the cosmos, the identity of the false god who had imprisoned human souls, and the secret path to spiritual liberation that would eventually free all of creation. These revelations were not presented as abstract theological concepts, but as practical instructions for spiritual transformation. The Gospel contained what early church fathers described as blasphemous rituals involving sacred sexuality, visionary practices, and invocations of feminine divine powers. Initiates were taught to see themselves as daughters of Eve, inheritors of her prophetic gifts, and carriers of the divine spark that Orthodox Christianity insisted was corrupted by original sin. The spread of these teachings throughout the Roman Empire created communities of believers who operated entirely outside the emerging Christian orthodoxy. They gathered in private homes, often led by women who claimed direct revelation from Sophia herself. Their meetings involved the reading of forbidden texts, the performance of ecstatic rituals, and the sharing of visions that were said to continue Eve's original revelation. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the Roman emperor known for his philosophical writings, encountered these communities during his travels and left cryptic references to women who claimed to speak with the voice of the First Mother. His private journals, discovered centuries later, describe meetings with female teachers who possessed knowledge of cosmic secrets that challenged even his Stoic understanding of the divine order. The emperor's interest in these forbidden teachings may have provided temporary protection for the communities that preserved the Gospel of Eve, but this shield disappeared with his death in 180 AD. His successor, Commodus, proved far less tolerant of religious diversity, and the systematic persecution of Gnostic communities began in earnest during his reign. By the 3rd century, the campaign against the Gospel of Eve had become a coordinated effort involving both religious and secular authorities. The text was placed on the first official lists of forbidden books, alongside other Gnostic scriptures that challenged orthodox doctrine. Possession of the gospel became a crime punishable by exile or death, and entire libraries were burned to ensure its complete destruction. Yet the teachings persisted in hidden forms. Archaeological evidence suggests that symbols associated with the Gospel of Eve continued to appear in Christian art and architecture long after the text itself had been officially eliminated. Serpents entwined around trees, women holding forbidden fruit, and images of Sophia as divine wisdom appeared in churches across the Mediterranean, often disguised as Orthodox Christian imagery, but carrying deeper meanings for those who knew how to read them. The catacombs beneath Rome contain some of the most intriguing examples of this hidden tradition. Frescoes dating from the 4th and 5th centuries depict scenes that appear to illustrate episodes from the lost gospel. One particularly striking image shows a woman receiving a scroll from a serpentine figure while standing beneath a tree heavy with fruit. The woman's face is painted with gold leaf, suggesting her divine status, and her posture indicates teaching rather than temptation. These underground chambers served as secret meeting places for communities that continued to honor Eve as humanity's first prophet. Inscriptions found in the deepest levels of the catacombs contain Greek and Coptic phrases that appear to be quotations from the suppressed gospel. One fragmentary text, carved into a burial niche, reads, "She who ate first shall teach last, and the wisdom of the mother shall confound the foolishness of the fathers." The survival of such evidence suggests that the Gospel of Eve was never completely eliminated, despite the Church's best efforts. Instead, it went underground, preserved by communities of believers who disguised their true teachings beneath layers of orthodox symbolism and coded language. They developed elaborate systems of concealment that allowed the forbidden knowledge to pass from generation to generation while avoiding detection by ecclesiastical authorities. Scholarly analysis of medieval manuscripts has revealed traces of this hidden tradition throughout European Christianity. Illuminated texts from monasteries across France, Germany, and England contain marginal decorations that appear to reference the suppressed gospel. Serpents appear with unusual frequency in these decorations, often positioned near female figures in ways that suggest reverence rather than condemnation. The persistence of these symbols indicates that the Gospel of Eve continued to influence Christian thought long after its official suppression. Monks and scribes, working in the very institutions dedicated to orthodox doctrine, found ways to preserve elements of the forbidden teaching through artistic expression. Their efforts created a visual language that spoke to initiates while remaining invisible to those who lacked the proper understanding. This underground tradition may have influenced some of the most significant mystical movements in medieval Christianity. The Beguines, communities of lay religious women who claimed direct access to divine revelation, demonstrated remarkable similarities to the female-led groups that had preserved the Gospel of Eve in earlier centuries. Their emphasis on personal mystical experience, their rejection of clerical authority, and their focus on the divine feminine aspects of God echoed themes that had characterized the suppressed gospel. The Church's response to the Beguines was strikingly similar to its earlier campaign against the Gospel of Eve. Leading Beguine mystics were condemned as heretics, their writings were burned, and their communities were forcibly dissolved. Marguerite Porete, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, was burned at the stake in 1310 for teachings that bore remarkable resemblance to the Gnostic doctrines associated with the lost gospel. The pattern repeated itself throughout medieval history. Whenever communities of believers claimed direct access to divine knowledge, particularly when led by women who claimed prophetic authority, the Church responded with accusations of heresy and demands for submission to orthodox doctrine. The specter of the Gospel of Eve haunted these confrontations, even when the text itself was never explicitly mentioned. The Renaissance brought new opportunities for the recovery of suppressed knowledge. Humanist scholars, with their passion for ancient texts and their skepticism toward medieval authority, began to piece together fragments of the lost tradition. Lorenzo Valla's exposure of the donation of Constantine as a forgery opened questions about what other church documents might be fraudulent or suppressed. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's exploration of Hermetic and Kabbalistic traditions led him to references that appeared to describe the lost Gospel of Eve. His private correspondence, discovered in the Vatican archives centuries later, contains tantalizing hints about a text that portrayed the first woman as a divine messenger rather than a temptress. Pico's interest in these forbidden teachings may have contributed to his eventual condemnation by church authorities. The printing press created new possibilities for the preservation and transmission of suppressed knowledge. Texts that had survived only in handwritten fragments could now be reproduced and distributed beyond the reach of ecclesiastical censors. The first printed editions of Gnostic texts began to appear in the 16th century, often published in Protestant territories where Catholic authority held less sway. These early printed works included fragmentary quotations from the Gospel of Eve, preserved in the writings of church fathers who had quoted the text while condemning it. Scholars began to reconstruct the lost gospel from these hostile witnesses, creating composite texts that approximated the original while acknowledging their incomplete and speculative nature. The Reformation provided additional opportunities for the recovery of suppressed Christian traditions. Protestant reformers, in their zeal to expose Catholic corruption, showed new interest in the texts that the medieval church had worked so hard to eliminate. While most reformers ultimately rejected Gnostic teachings as heretical, their willingness to question Catholic authority opened space for scholarly investigation of the suppressed tradition. Some radical Reformation groups went further, embracing aspects of the Gnostic worldview that resonated with their own rejection of institutional Christianity. The Anabaptists, with their emphasis on personal revelation and their rejection of infant baptism, showed particular interest in texts that portrayed direct divine communication outside ecclesiastical channels. These connections were not lost on Catholic authorities, who saw in Protestant reform movements the same dangerous tendencies that had characterized the ancient communities that preserved the Gospel of Eve. The Council of Trent's condemnation of private interpretation of Scripture was, in part, a response to the perceived threat of individuals claiming direct access to divine knowledge without clerical mediation. The Age of Exploration brought European scholars into contact with Eastern Christian traditions that had preserved texts unknown in the West. Coptic monasteries in Egypt contained libraries that had escaped the medieval purges, and some of these collections included fragments that appeared to reference the lost Gospel of Eve. Jesuit missionaries, despite their commitment to Catholic orthodoxy, proved surprisingly effective at recovering and preserving these ancient texts. Their linguistic skills and their access to remote libraries allowed them to document traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. Some of their discoveries found their way back to European collections, where they awaited scholars with the knowledge and courage to interpret their significance. The Enlightenment brought new attitudes toward religious authority and historical investigation that would prove crucial for understanding the suppressed tradition. Voltaire's attacks on church corruption and his advocacy for religious tolerance created an intellectual climate more favorable to the investigation of suppressed texts. Edward Gibbon's monumental history of the Roman Empire included discussions of early Christian controversies that acknowledged the complexity of doctrinal development. These intellectual currents prepared the ground for the systematic recovery of the Gospel of Eve and related texts that would begin in earnest during the 19th century. The stage was set for discoveries that would revolutionize scholarly understanding of early Christianity and reveal the true scope of what had been lost when the Church eliminated its most dangerous competitors for spiritual authority. The 19th century dawned with promises of scientific rationalism and historical objectivity, yet it was precisely these new methodologies that would uncover the most dangerous truths about Christianity's suppressed past. German biblical scholars, armed with techniques of textual criticism that had revolutionized classical studies, began to dissect the New Testament with unprecedented rigor. What they discovered would shake the foundations of faith across Europe and beyond. Friedrich Schleiermacher's groundbreaking work on hermeneutics opened new avenues for understanding ancient texts within their historical contexts. His students, particularly Ferdinand Christian Bauer and the Tübingen School, applied these methods to early Christian literature with results that scandalized Orthodox believers. They demonstrated that the New Testament itself was a composite document, assembled from competing traditions that reflected profound theological disagreements within the early church. These scholarly investigations inevitably led to questions about what other texts had been excluded from the canonical collection. If the books that made it into the New Testament represented only one faction's victory in ancient theological debates, what had happened to the writings of the losing sides? The search for these suppressed voices became one of the driving forces behind 19th century biblical archaeology. The first major breakthrough came in 1886, when French archaeologists working in Egypt discovered a cache of papyrus fragments in the ancient city of Akhmim. Among these documents was a Greek manuscript containing portions of the Gospel of Peter, a text that early church fathers had condemned and supposedly destroyed. The discovery proved that suppressed Christian writings had survived in the Egyptian desert, preserved by the very dryness that had claimed so many other ancient documents. More discoveries followed in rapid succession. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, excavated by Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt beginning in 1896, contained fragments of numerous non-canonical Gospels and other early Christian texts. Among these fragments were quotations that matched patristic references to the Gospel of Eve, confirming that the text had indeed existed and possessed the theological content that had so alarmed ancient church authorities. One particular papyrus fragment, catalogued as POXY 654, contained a dialogue between a figure identified as the First Mother and a serpentine being described as the Bearer of Light. The conversation centered on the nature of divine knowledge and the cosmic hierarchy that governed human existence. While the fragment was too damaged to provide a complete text, its theological content clearly aligned with descriptions of the Gospel of Eve found in the writings of Epiphanius and other church fathers. The discovery of these fragments sparked intense scholarly debate about the nature and extent of early Christian diversity. Liberal Protestant scholars embraced the findings as evidence that primitive Christianity had been far more varied and democratic than later orthodoxy suggested. Catholic scholars, while acknowledging the historical importance of the discoveries, maintained that the suppressed texts represented heretical deviations from authentic apostolic tradition. The debate intensified when additional papyrus finds began to reveal the sophisticated theological systems that had underlain the suppressed texts. The Gospel of Eve, as reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, appeared to present a complete alternative to Orthodox Christianity, with its own understanding of salvation history, its own interpretation of biblical narratives, and its own practices for achieving spiritual transformation. Central to this alternative system was a radical reinterpretation of the creation narrative that elevated feminine wisdom to cosmic significance. According to the reconstructed gospel, the divine realm was populated by paired male and female principles, with Sophia representing the feminine aspect of ultimate reality. The material world had come into existence through Sophia's desire to know the unknowable depths of divinity, a desire that had resulted in the birth of the demiurge and the subsequent imprisonment of divine sparks within material bodies. Eve's role in this cosmic drama was that of liberator rather than temptress. Her decision to eat from the tree of knowledge represented the first successful attempt by imprisoned divinity to break free from the demiurge's control. The serpent that approached her was not Satan, but a messenger from the true God, offering her the gnosis necessary to escape the material prison and return to her divine source. This interpretation transformed every element of the traditional narrative. Adam's initial reluctance to eat the forbidden fruit became evidence of his spiritual sluggishness rather than his moral purity. Eve's persuasion of Adam represented the awakening of divine consciousness within humanity. Their expulsion from Eden was not punishment for sin, but liberation from a false paradise designed to keep divine souls in ignorant servitude. The theological implications of this alternative narrative were staggering. If Eve was humanity's first redeemer, if the serpent was a divine messenger, if the God of Genesis was a false deity, then the entire structure of Christian doctrine required fundamental revision. The Church's teaching about original sin, the necessity of Christ's sacrifice, and the nature of salvation itself came under question. Even more threatening was the Gospel's apparent teaching about continuing revelation through feminine spiritual authority. According to patristic sources, the text claimed that Eve's prophetic gift had been passed down through successive generations of women who maintained direct communication with Sophia. These female teachers possessed secret knowledge that enabled them to guide other souls toward liberation from material bondage. The reconstruction of these teachings revealed why the Church had been so determined to eliminate every trace of the Gospel of Eve. Here was a complete theological system that not only challenged orthodox doctrine, but provided an alternative path to salvation that bypassed ecclesiastical authority entirely. Women who embraced these teachings could claim prophetic status equal to any apostle, direct revelation superior to any bishop's interpretation, and spiritual authority that transcended all institutional hierarchies. Archaeological evidence from Egypt began to support scholarly reconstructions of how these alternative Christian communities had actually functioned. Excavations at sites like Nag Hammadi and Medinet Mahdi revealed the remains of monastic complexes that had preserved Gnostic literature long after such texts had been eliminated elsewhere. These communities appeared to have maintained the traditions associated with the Gospel of Eve well into the Byzantine period, centuries after the text's official suppression. The layout of these monastic sites suggested forms of religious organization quite different from Orthodox Christian monasteries. Rather than the hierarchical structures that characterized mainstream monasticism, these communities appeared to have been organized around the authority of individual teachers who claimed direct spiritual insight. Many of these teachers were women, and their tombs were marked with symbols that clearly referenced the suppressed gospel traditions. One particularly significant discovery came from the monastery at Kelia, where archaeologists uncovered a library chamber that had been sealed since the 7th century. Among the texts found in this hidden repository were complete copies of several Gnostic Gospels, including substantial portions of what appeared to be the Gospel of Eve itself. The manuscript, written in Coptic with occasional Greek phrases, contained extended passages that had been completely lost to previous scholarly reconstruction. The newly recovered text revealed the full scope of Eve's supposed revelations and their implications for human spiritual development. According to the Gospel, Eve's encounter with the divine messenger in Eden was only the beginning of a series of visions that continued throughout her earthly life and beyond. These visions revealed the structure of the cosmic hierarchy, the names and powers of the various divine beings that governed different aspects of existence, and the secret formulas necessary for the soul's ascent through the heavenly spheres. Most significantly, the text described in detail the rituals and practices that Eve had supposedly established for the preservation and transmission of divine gnosis. These included elaborate ceremonies involving sacred sexuality, visionary techniques using special mirrors and incense, and invocations of the hidden names of Sophia that were said to open direct channels of communication with the divine realm. The Gospel portrayed these practices as continuing among Eve's spiritual descendants, creating an unbroken chain of transmission that connected contemporary practitioners with humanity's first prophetic revelation. Women who participated in these rituals were said to experience direct contact with Sophia herself, receiving personal revelations that guided their spiritual development and enabled them to serve as teachers for others seeking liberation. The manuscript also contained what appeared to be autobiographical accounts from women who claimed to have received such revelations. These narratives described ecstatic experiences involving encounters with luminous beings, journeys through cosmic realms, and the reception of secret knowledge that transformed their understanding of reality. The similarity of these accounts to reports from later Christian mystics suggested that the traditions associated with the Gospel of Eve had indeed influenced subsequent spiritual movements. Academic study of the newly discovered manuscript revealed sophisticated theological concepts that challenged prevailing assumptions about the intellectual capacity of early Christian communities. The text demonstrated familiarity with Platonic philosophy, Jewish mystical traditions, and mystery religion practices that required considerable education to understand and synthesize. This suggested that the communities preserving the Gospel of Eve included individuals with access to the highest levels of ancient learning. The implications extended beyond theological history to questions about the social and cultural dynamics of early Christianity. If the Gospel of Eve had indeed been widely circulated and influential, as the manuscript evidence suggested, then the standard narrative of Christian development required substantial revision. Rather than a straightforward progression from apostolic preaching to orthodox doctrine, early Christianity appeared to have been a complex battleground where competing visions of spiritual truth struggled for dominance. The newly discovered text also shed light on why the Gospel of Eve had been considered so particularly dangerous by church authorities. Beyond its challenge to specific doctrines, the Gospel presented a complete alternative worldview that undermined the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority. Its teaching that divine knowledge was directly accessible to properly prepared individuals eliminated the need for priestly mediation, while its elevation of feminine spiritual authority challenged the patriarchal structure of emerging orthodoxy. Perhaps most threatening of all was the Gospel's apparent claim that the God worshipped by Orthodox Christians was not the ultimate divine reality, but a false deity who had usurped authority that rightfully belonged to higher spiritual powers. This teaching, known as anti-cosmic dualism, suggested that the material world itself was a prison from which souls needed to escape, rather than a divine creation to be celebrated and preserved. The discovery of the complete manuscript allowed scholars to trace the influence of the Gospel of Eve through subsequent religious movements with unprecedented precision. Elements of its theology appeared in the teachings of the Cathars, the mystical writings of Meister Eckhart, and even some aspects of Renaissance Hermeticism. The text's influence seemed to have persisted through underground transmission long after its official elimination. Modern psychological analysis of the Gospel's contents revealed sophisticated understanding of altered states of consciousness and techniques for inducing mystical experience. The rituals described in the text showed remarkable similarity to practices found in various esoteric traditions, suggesting either common origins or successful transmission of ancient knowledge through hidden channels. The manuscript's account of Eve's continuing revelations also provided new insight into the role of women in preserving and transmitting spiritual knowledge throughout history. The text suggested that female spiritual authority had been systematically suppressed not only in Christianity, but in many other religious traditions as well, part of a broader pattern of patriarchal control over access to the divine. Contemporary feminist scholars embraced these discoveries as evidence that women had played far more significant roles in early Christianity than Orthodox sources suggested. The Gospel of Eve became a powerful symbol of suppressed feminine spirituality, representing knowledge and authority that had been stolen from women by male-dominated religious institutions. However, the manuscript also revealed disturbing aspects of the traditions it described. Some of the rituals associated with the gospel appeared to involve practices that modern readers would find morally questionable, including forms of sacred sexuality that may have exploited vulnerable individuals. These elements complicated attempts to present the suppressed traditions as unambiguously positive alternatives to Orthodox Christianity. The ethical complexities revealed in the manuscript forced scholars to grapple with difficult questions about how to evaluate ancient religious movements. While the Gospel of Eve clearly represented an alternative to patriarchal religious authority, it also embodied assumptions about gender, sexuality, and spiritual hierarchy that were problematic by contemporary standards. These discoveries occurred during a period when European society was undergoing profound transformations that affected attitudes toward religious authority and spiritual knowledge. The rise of spiritualism, the growing influence of Eastern religious traditions, and the development of modern psychology all created new contexts for understanding the suppressed gospel traditions. Theosophical societies and other esoteric organizations seized upon the Gospel of Eve as evidence for their claims about ancient wisdom traditions that had been preserved in hidden forms throughout history. Helena Blavatsky and her followers argued that the suppressed gospel represented fragments of a universal gnosis that had once been known to initiates in all religious traditions. These interpretations, while often historically questionable, reflected genuine hunger for spiritual alternatives to both Orthodox Christianity and materialistic rationalism. The Gospel of Eve became a symbol of possibilities for direct spiritual experience that transcended institutional religious boundaries and offered individuals access to transformative knowledge. The influence of these discoveries extended beyond academic circles to affect popular culture and artistic expression. Writers, artists, and musicians began to explore themes derived from the suppressed gospel traditions, creating works that imagined what Christianity might have become if alternative voices had not been silenced. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Eve thus marked more than just an important archaeological find. It represented the recovery of an entire worldview that had been systematically eliminated from Western consciousness, opening new possibilities for understanding both the past and the future of human spiritual development. The 20th century brought revelations that would shatter scholarly assumptions about the scope and sophistication of the suppressed tradition. In December 1945, two Egyptian farmers digging for fertilizer near the village of Nag Hammadi struck earthenware jars buried in the desert sand. What they discovered would prove to be the most significant archaeological find in the history of early Christianity, a complete library of Gnostic texts that had been hidden for over 1,500 years. Among the 52 treatises found in those ancient jars were Gospels, apocalypses, and theological treatises that provided unprecedented insight into the alternative Christian movements that had flourished before their systematic elimination. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the secret book of John revealed sophisticated theological systems that had competed with Orthodox Christianity for the souls of believers throughout the Mediterranean world. But it was the discovery of a previously unknown text, catalogued simply as Codex II, Tractate 4, that sent shockwaves through the scholarly community. This manuscript, written in Coptic but clearly translated from an earlier Greek original, bore the unmistakable characteristics of the long-lost Gospel of Eve. The opening lines left no doubt about the text's identity or its explosive contents. The manuscript began with Eve herself speaking in the first person, describing her awakening to divine consciousness in language that echoed the most profound mystical literature ever written. She spoke of standing before the tree of knowledge, not as a naive woman tempted by a serpent, but as a seeker of wisdom who understood the cosmic significance of her choice. According to this recovered text, Eve's decision to eat the forbidden fruit was made in full knowledge of its consequences. She had received prior revelation from Sophia, the divine feminine principle, who had appeared to her in dreams and visions to explain the true nature of her imprisonment in the material realm. The serpent was merely the final messenger, confirming what she had already learned through direct divine communication. The Gospel described in vivid detail Eve's mystical experiences following her consumption of the forbidden fruit. As the knowledge flooded her consciousness, she experienced what the text called the Great Awakening, a transformation that revealed the illusory nature of the material world and her true identity as a divine being temporarily trapped in flesh. These revelations were not portrayed as abstract theological concepts, but as lived experiences that fundamentally altered Eve's perception of reality. She saw through the false paradise of Eden to perceive the cosmic prison that it truly represented. She recognized the being who had forbidden knowledge as the demiurge, a lesser deity who sought to keep divine souls in ignorant bondage. Most significantly, the Gospel revealed that Eve's awakening was not an isolated event, but the first step in a cosmic process of liberation that would eventually free all imprisoned souls from material bondage. Her role was that of the first Redeemer, the pioneer who had discovered the path that others would follow. The text described how Eve immediately set about awakening Adam to the same divine consciousness she had achieved. This process required more than simply sharing the forbidden fruit. Eve had to serve as Adam's spiritual teacher, gradually opening his awareness to truths that his mind was not yet prepared to comprehend. The Gospel portrayed these teaching sessions in remarkable detail, showing Eve using techniques that would later be recognized in various mystical traditions. She employed sacred geometry, visionary practices, and invocations of divine names to awaken Adam's dormant spiritual faculties. The process was described as difficult and dangerous, requiring careful preparation to prevent psychological damage. When Adam finally achieved his own awakening, the Gospel described a cosmic celebration in the divine realms. Sophia herself was said to have descended to congratulate the first human couple on their successful escape from the demiurge's deception. The scene was portrayed with liturgical language that suggested it had been used in actual worship services by communities that revered Eve as their spiritual ancestor. The newly discovered Gospel also contained extensive teachings that Eve supposedly received during her exile from Eden. Far from depicting this exile as punishment, the text portrayed it as liberation from a false paradise that had kept divine souls in comfortable ignorance. Eve's banishment allowed her to begin the work of awakening other souls to their true divine nature. These post-Eden revelations included detailed instructions for spiritual practices designed to facilitate the same awakening that Eve had experienced. The text described meditation techniques, dietary restrictions, and ritual practices that would prepare the soul for direct encounter with divine wisdom. These practices were clearly intended for use by actual communities of believers who saw themselves as Eve's spiritual descendants. The Gospel contained what appeared to be liturgical formulas for group ceremonies that reenacted Eve's original awakening. Participants were assigned roles representing various figures in the cosmic drama, with women typically taking the part of Eve herself. These rituals were designed to induce collective mystical experiences that would confirm the truth of the Gospel's teachings. Archaeological evidence from the Nag Hammadi site suggested that these ceremonial practices had indeed been performed by the community that preserved the manuscripts. Excavations revealed the remains of a complex that included spaces clearly designed for group meditation and ritual performance. The layout of these chambers corresponded closely to descriptions found in the recovered Gospel. The discovery of the complete text allowed scholars to understand for the first time the full scope of the theological system that had so alarmed early church authorities. The Gospel of Eve presented a comprehensive alternative to orthodox Christianity that challenged every major doctrine while offering a complete path to salvation that required no institutional mediation. Central to this system was the concept of gnosis, divine knowledge that could only be acquired through direct spiritual experience rather than through faith or scriptural study. The Gospel taught that this knowledge was humanity's birthright, stolen by the demiurge and his servants, but recoverable through proper instruction and practice. Eve's role as the first recipient of Gnosis made her the archetypal spiritual teacher, the model that all subsequent instructors should emulate. The Gospel suggested that her prophetic gift continued to manifest through women who achieved similar awakening, creating an unbroken lineage of female spiritual authority that stretched from Eden to the communities that preserved the text. This teaching had profound implications for understanding the role of women in early Christian movements. While Orthodox Christianity increasingly restricted female participation in religious leadership, the communities that revered the Gospel of Eve elevated women to positions of supreme spiritual authority based on their connection to humanity's first prophet. The Gospel contained biographical accounts of women who claimed to be Eve's spiritual successors, describing their own mystical experiences and teaching activities. These narratives revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological and spiritual development that rivaled the best insights of ancient philosophy and mystery religion. One particularly striking account described a woman named Norea, identified as Eve's daughter, who received direct revelation from Sophia about the future liberation of all imprisoned souls. Norea's visions included detailed prophecies about the eventual destruction of the material world and the return of divine sparks to their heavenly source. The Gospel portrayed Norea as establishing the first organized communities dedicated to preserving and transmitting Eve's teachings. These groups were described as networks of initiates who met in secret to share mystical experiences and prepare for the cosmic transformation that would end the demiurge's dominion over creation. The text provided specific instructions for identifying and training individuals capable of receiving divine gnosis. These guidelines revealed sophisticated understanding of personality types and psychological predispositions that would later be recognized in various spiritual traditions. Candidates for initiation were subjected to extensive testing designed to assess their spiritual maturity and commitment to the path of liberation. The Gospel described elaborate procedures for evaluating potential students, including dream analysis, meditation assessment, and moral examination. Those who passed these tests were gradually introduced to increasingly advanced teachings and practices. The Gospel outlined a curriculum that began with basic cosmological instruction and progressed through various levels of mystical experience toward the ultimate goal of achieving the same divine consciousness that Eve had attained. The highest levels of initiation involved practices that the Gospel described in deliberately obscure language, apparently to prevent unauthorized individuals from attempting dangerous spiritual techniques without proper preparation. These advanced practices included forms of sacred sexuality, ecstatic trance states, and direct invocation of divine powers. Modern scholars studying these passages have noted remarkable similarities to techniques found in Tantric Buddhism, Jewish Kabbalah, and various shamanic traditions. This suggests either common origins in ancient mystical practices or successful transmission of spiritual technologies across cultural boundaries. The Gospel's influence on subsequent religious movements became clear as scholars traced its theological concepts through later historical periods. Elements of its teaching appeared in the writings of medieval mystics, Renaissance esotericists, and even some modern spiritual movements. The Cathar communities of medieval France showed particular affinity for concepts derived from the Gospel of Eve. Their dualistic theology, their reverence for feminine spiritual authority, and their rejection of Orthodox Christian sacraments all echoed themes found in the suppressed Gospel. The brutal suppression of the Cathars by the Catholic Church in the 13th century followed patterns established during the earlier campaign against Gnostic Christianity. Entire communities were massacred, libraries were burned, and survivors were forced to recant their beliefs or face execution. Similar patterns emerged during the persecution of other groups that showed influence from the suppressed gospel tradition. The Begins, the Free Spirit movement, and various mystical communities throughout medieval Europe All faced accusations of heresy that specifically targeted their claims to direct divine revelation and their elevation of feminine spiritual authority. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient wisdom traditions that included the suppressed gospel texts. Humanist scholars like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino sought to recover the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology that they believed had been preserved in various esoteric traditions throughout history. These efforts led to the rediscovery of Hermetic texts, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Jewish mystical literature that showed clear influence from the same sources that had produced the Gospel of Eve. The resulting synthesis created new forms of Christian mysticism that challenged orthodox doctrine while claiming to represent authentic ancient tradition. The Protestant Reformation provided additional opportunities for the recovery of suppressed spiritual traditions. Reformers like Jacob Boehme and Valentin Weigel developed theological systems that incorporated concepts clearly derived from Gnostic sources, including the Gospel of Eve tradition. These Protestant mystics faced persecution from both Catholic and mainstream Protestant authorities, who recognized the dangerous implications of their teachings for institutional religious authority. Their writings were banned, their followers were persecuted, and their communities were forced underground. The survival of these movements demonstrated the persistent appeal of spiritual traditions that promised direct access to divine knowledge without institutional mediation. The Gospel of Eve had provided the theological foundation for a form of Christianity that threatened the very basis of ecclesiastical power. The Enlightenment brought new tools for historical analysis that would eventually lead to the recovery of the suppressed gospel tradition. Scholars like Edward Gibbon and David Hume applied rational criticism to Christian history, revealing the complex political and social forces that had shaped orthodox doctrine. These investigations prepared the intellectual ground for the archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries that would finally bring the Gospel of Eve back to light. The text that church authorities had worked so hard to eliminate was returning to challenge religious authority once again. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond academic historical research. The recovery of the Gospel of Eve raised fundamental questions about the nature of religious truth, the role of institutional authority in spiritual development, and the relationship between masculine and feminine principles in divine revelation. Modern psychological research into mystical experience provided new frameworks for understanding the spiritual phenomena described in the Gospel. Studies of altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, and spontaneous spiritual awakening suggested that the experiences attributed to Eve and her followers might have been genuine psychological events rather than mere theological speculation. Feminist theologians embraced the Gospel of Eve as evidence for their arguments about the systematic suppression of feminine spiritual authority in Western religion. The text became a rallying point for movements seeking to recover the divine feminine and restore women to positions of religious leadership. However, the Gospel also posed challenges for modern readers seeking to appropriate its teachings for contemporary spiritual practice. The text's cosmological assumptions, its attitude toward the material world, and some of its ritual practices reflected ancient worldviews that were difficult to reconcile with modern scientific understanding. The ethical implications of the Gospel's teachings remained controversial among scholars and practitioners alike. While the text challenged patriarchal religious authority, it also embodied assumptions about spiritual hierarchy and elite knowledge that were problematic from democratic perspectives. Contemporary Gnostic movements attempted to revive the traditions described in the Gospel of Eve, creating new communities dedicated to the pursuit of direct spiritual experience through ancient techniques. These groups faced the challenge of adapting ancient practices to modern contexts while preserving their essential spiritual content. The influence of the recovered gospel extended into popular culture, inspiring novels, films, and artistic works that explored themes of hidden knowledge, suppressed wisdom, and alternative spirituality. These cultural productions helped to spread awareness of the suppressed tradition while often distorting its historical and theological content. Academic conferences and scholarly journals devoted increasing attention to the Gospel of Eve and related texts as researchers worked to understand their historical significance and contemporary relevance. New translations, commentaries, and analytical studies appeared regularly, each contributing to a growing body of knowledge about the suppressed tradition. The digital age brought new opportunities for preserving and disseminating the recovered texts. Online databases made the Gospel of Eve and related documents available to researchers and interested readers around the world, ensuring that these texts could never again be completely suppressed. Archaeological work continued to reveal new evidence about the communities that had preserved the Gospel tradition. Excavations at sites throughout the Mediterranean region uncovered additional manuscripts, ritual objects, and architectural remains that shed light on how these alternative Christian movements had actually functioned. Linguistic analysis of the recovered texts revealed complex patterns of influence and transmission that helped scholars trace the development and spread of the Gospel tradition. These studies showed how ideas from the Gospel of Eve had influenced religious movements across cultural and geographical boundaries. The recovery of the Gospel of Eve represented more than just an important archaeological discovery. It marked the return of an entire worldview that had been systematically eliminated from Western consciousness, offering new possibilities for understanding both the past and the future of human spiritual development. Yet questions remained about the ultimate significance of these discoveries. Had the Church been justified in suppressing teachings that it viewed as dangerous to the spiritual welfare of believers? Were the alternative traditions represented by the Gospel of Eve truly superior to Orthodox Christianity, or did they represent dangerous deviations from authentic spiritual truth? The debate continued among scholars, theologians, and practitioners as they grappled with the implications of texts that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine revelation, religious authority, and spiritual development. The Gospel of Eve had returned from its centuries of enforced silence to pose questions that contemporary society was still struggling to answer. The manuscript that had survived in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years had finally fulfilled its purpose, carrying its dangerous message across the centuries to a world that was perhaps finally ready to hear what Eve herself had supposedly learned in that primordial garden when she first tasted the fruit of divine knowledge. Knowledge. The implications of the Nag Hammadi discovery reverberated through academic circles like seismic tremors, but the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In 1978, while examining a previously uncatalogued fragment from the collection, scholar Elaine Pagels made a discovery that would send chills through the Vatican's highest echelons. Hidden within the binding of another manuscript was a small papyrus scroll, its edges blackened with age, but its text remarkably preserved. This fragment contained what appeared to be a direct quotation from the Gospel of Eve, but unlike the hostile citations preserved by church fathers, this passage was presented with reverence and authority. The text identified itself as the secret words of the first mother, spoken to her daughters in the days of exile. The implications were staggering. Here was evidence that the gospel had been transmitted through an unbroken lineage of female spiritual teachers who had maintained its teachings across centuries of persecution. The fragment described a ritual practice known as the Mirror of Sophia, in which initiated women would gaze into polished bronze surfaces while reciting sacred formulas derived from Eve's original revelations. According to the text, these mirrors served as portals through which practitioners could communicate directly with the divine feminine principle, receiving personal guidance and prophetic visions that continued Eve's role as humanity's spiritual guide. Contemporary accounts from Roman historians suddenly took on new significance as scholars recognized descriptions of mysterious female cults that had operated throughout the empire. Pliny the Younger's letters to Emperor Trajan contained puzzling references to women who claimed to speak with the voice of the First Mother and who performed nocturnal ceremonies involving mirrors and serpent imagery. These historical fragments suggested that the Gospel of Eve had not merely survived in isolated monastic libraries, but but had maintained active communities of practitioners who continued to develop and expand its teachings. The discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about how suppressed religious movements actually functioned and persisted through periods of intense persecution. Archaeological excavations beneath several ancient churches in Rome revealed chambers that had clearly been used for secret gatherings long before Christian construction began above them. These underground spaces contained altar niches carved with symbols that directly corresponded to imagery described in the Gospel of Eve. Serpents entwined around fruit-bearing trees, women holding luminous orbs, and female figures with multiple arms extending in gestures of teaching and blessing adorned the walls. Carbon dating of the carved reliefs placed their creation in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, exactly the period when the Gospel of Eve was supposedly being eliminated by church authorities. The chamber's concealed entrances and elaborate ventilation systems indicated sophisticated planning for clandestine activities that needed to remain hidden from official scrutiny. Most intriguingly, several of these underground chambers contained evidence of continuous use extending well into the medieval period. Layers of ritual deposits revealed that the spaces had been regularly maintained and utilized by succeeding generations of practitioners who had somehow managed to preserve their dangerous traditions through centuries of Christian dominance. The discovery of these hidden sanctuaries provided crucial insight into how the gospel tradition had actually survived. Rather than disappearing entirely under church persecution, the communities that preserved Eve's teachings had simply gone underground, literally and figuratively. They had developed elaborate systems of concealment that allowed them to continue their practices while avoiding detection by ecclesiastical authorities. Detailed analysis of the ritual deposits found in these chambers revealed sophisticated understanding of psychoactive substances and their use in inducing mystical experiences. Residues of various herbs and resins matched descriptions found in the recovered gospel texts, confirming that the practices described in ancient manuscripts had indeed been performed by actual communities of believers. The implications extended beyond historical curiosity to questions about the continuity of suppressed spiritual traditions. If the Gospel of Eve communities had maintained unbroken transmission of their teachings, then the text represented not merely an ancient curiosity, but a living tradition that had somehow survived into the modern era. Investigations into medieval and Renaissance esoteric movements revealed striking parallels to practices described in the Gospel of Eve. The Cathar's reverence for feminine spiritual authority, the Beguine's emphasis on direct mystical experience, and various alchemical traditions' focus on the divine feminine all showed clear influence from the suppressed gospel tradition. The Knights Templar, whose mysterious practices and sudden suppression by the church had puzzled historians for centuries, left behind artifacts that suggested familiarity with Gospel of Eve symbolism. Carved stones from Templar sites across Europe displayed serpent imagery and female figures that closely matched descriptions found in the recovered manuscripts. The Templars' famous reverence for the feminine divine, manifested in their devotion to the Black Madonna and various female saints, took on new significance when viewed through the lens of the gospel tradition. Their secret initiation ceremonies, their emphasis on direct spiritual experience, and their eventual persecution by church authorities all followed patterns established by earlier communities that had preserved Eve's teachings. The suppression of the Templars in 1307 represented another chapter in the Church's ongoing campaign against traditions that challenged orthodox doctrine and ecclesiastical authority. The accusations of heresy, idolatry, and blasphemous practices that were leveled against the order echoed charges that had been made against Gospel of Eve communities 1,000 years earlier. Documents from the Templar trials, preserved in Vatican archives, contained testimony that specifically mentioned rituals involving female figures identified as the first teacher and the bearer of sacred knowledge. These references suggested that the Templars had indeed maintained connections to the suppressed gospel tradition, adapting its teachings to their own organizational structure and spiritual practices. The broader pattern that emerged from these investigations revealed a hidden history of Western spirituality that had operated parallel to official Christianity for over a millennium. The Gospel of Eve had provided the theological foundation for a continuous tradition of alternative spiritual practice that had influenced numerous religious movements while remaining largely invisible to mainstream historical scholarship. Renaissance magical traditions showed particularly strong influence from the Gospel lineage. Figures like Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, and John Dee incorporated concepts clearly derived from Gnostic sources, including specific references to feminine divine wisdom and the spiritual authority of women as bearers of secret knowledge. The development of European witchcraft traditions during the medieval and early modern periods also showed striking parallels to practices described in the Gospel of Eve. The emphasis on female spiritual leadership, the use of natural substances to induce altered consciousness, and the reverence for serpent symbolism all echoed themes found in the suppressed Gospel. The infamous witch trials of the 15th through 17th centuries took on new significance when viewed as continuation of the Church's campaign against traditions that challenged orthodox authority. The specific charges leveled against accused witches often corresponded precisely to practices attributed to Gospel of Eve communities in ancient sources. Scholarly analysis of witch trial transcripts revealed that many of the accused women described spiritual experiences remarkably similar to those attributed to Eve in the recovered gospel texts. They spoke of receiving direct revelation from female divine figures, of participating in secret ceremonies that connected them to ancient wisdom traditions, and of possessing knowledge that threatened established religious authority. The systematic persecution and execution of these women represented the final phase of the Church's effort to eliminate the spiritual tradition that had originated with the Gospel of Eve. By destroying the communities that preserved this alternative path to divine knowledge, ecclesiastical authorities sought to ensure that their monopoly on salvation would never again face serious challenge. Yet even this brutal campaign failed to completely eliminate the suppressed tradition. Elements of the gospel teaching survived in folk practices, oral traditions, and carefully guarded family lineages that transmitted fragments of the ancient wisdom across generations. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries witnessed renewed interest in these suppressed traditions as scholars and artists began to question the completeness of official historical narratives. Poets like William Blake and Percy Shelley drew inspiration from Gnostic themes, creating works that celebrated the figure of Eve as a bringer of divine knowledge rather than the cause of human downfall. Blake's prophetic writings, in particular, showed remarkable familiarity with concepts derived from the Gospel of Eve tradition. His portrayal of feminine divine wisdom, his critique of oppressive religious authority, and his vision of spiritual liberation through the acquisition of hidden knowledge all echoed themes found in the ancient text. The influence extended to musical composition as well, with composers like Richard Wagner incorporating Gnostic themes into their operas. Wagner's exploration of redemption through feminine wisdom and his critique of religious hypocrisy reflected ideas that could be traced back to the Gospel of Eve and its radical reinterpretation of spiritual authority. These cultural developments prepared the intellectual ground for the archaeological discoveries that would eventually bring the gospel tradition back to full scholarly attention. The text that had been driven underground by centuries of persecution was finally emerging into the light of academic investigation and public awareness. Modern neuroscientific research into mystical experience provided new frameworks for understanding the phenomena described in the Gospel of Eve. Studies of meditation, psychoactive substances, and spontaneous spiritual awakening suggested that the experiences attributed to Eve and her followers might represent genuine neurological events rather than mere religious fantasy. Brain imaging studies of individuals undergoing mystical experiences revealed patterns of neural activity that corresponded remarkably well to descriptions found in the ancient gospel texts. The dissolution of ego boundaries, the perception of cosmic unity, and the reception of profound insights all appeared to reflect specific neurological processes that could be induced through various spiritual practices. These scientific findings lent credibility to claims that the Gospel of Eve represented a sophisticated understanding of consciousness and its potential for transformation. The text's detailed descriptions of techniques for inducing mystical states suggested that its authors possessed empirical knowledge about the nature of spiritual experience that had been acquired through systematic experimentation. Anthropological studies of contemporary shamanic traditions revealed striking parallels to practices described in the Gospel of Eve. Indigenous cultures around the world maintained spiritual techniques involving female ritual leadership, serpent symbolism, and the use of natural substances to facilitate communication with divine powers. These cross-cultural similarities suggested that the gospel tradition might have preserved elements of an ancient universal shamanic practice that predated organized religion. Eve's role as the first recipient of divine knowledge corresponded to the archetypal figure of the female shaman who served as mediator between human and divine realms in many traditional cultures. The persistence of these themes across diverse cultural contexts indicated that the spiritual insights preserved in the Gospel of Eve reflected fundamental aspects of human consciousness, rather than merely sectarian religious doctrine. The text appeared to describe universal potentials for mystical experience that remained accessible to properly prepared individuals, regardless of their cultural background. Contemporary feminist spirituality movements embraced the Gospel of Eve as validation for their efforts to recover suppressed feminine wisdom traditions. The text provided historical precedent for claims that women had been systematically excluded from positions of spiritual authority, and that their unique insights had been deliberately suppressed by patriarchal religious institutions. Modern practitioners attempted to reconstruct the rituals and practices described in the ancient gospel, creating new forms of spiritual community based on the principles of direct divine revelation and feminine religious leadership. These efforts faced challenges in adapting ancient techniques to contemporary contexts while preserving their essential spiritual content. The ethical implications of these reconstruction efforts remained controversial among scholars and practitioners. While the gospel offered alternatives to patriarchal religious authority, it also embodied ancient assumptions about spiritual hierarchy and elite knowledge that were difficult to reconcile with democratic values. Psychological studies of individuals who participated in neo-Gnostic spiritual practices revealed both benefits and risks associated with techniques derived from the gospel tradition. While many participants reported profound spiritual insights and psychological healing, others experienced destabilization and confusion that required professional therapeutic intervention. These findings highlighted the importance of proper preparation and guidance when engaging with the powerful spiritual technologies described in the ancient texts. The Gospel of Eve had apparently preserved genuine methods for inducing transformative spiritual experiences, but these techniques required careful application to avoid psychological harm. The debate over the Gospel's contemporary relevance reflected broader questions about the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Could spiritual insights from a pre-scientific era provide meaningful guidance for contemporary seekers, or were they merely historical curiosities that belonged in museums rather than meditation halls? Academic conferences devoted increasing attention to these questions as scholars from various disciplines attempted to evaluate the significance of the recovered gospel tradition. Historians, theologians, psychologists, and neuroscientists brought different perspectives to bear on the ancient texts, creating interdisciplinary dialogue about their meaning and implications. The Vatican's response to these developments remained officially restrained, but internal documents leaked by reform-minded clergy revealed deep concern about the Gospel's potential impact on Catholic doctrine and authority. Seminary curricula were quietly modified to include instruction about Gnostic texts, and priests were provided with guidelines for addressing questions from parishioners who had learned about the suppressed gospel tradition. Protestant denominations showed greater willingness to engage with the recovered texts, viewing them as part of the broader historical context that had shaped early Christianity. Some progressive congregations incorporated elements of the gospel tradition into their worship services, creating new liturgies that honored feminine divine wisdom alongside traditional masculine imagery. Orthodox Christianity, with its ancient liturgical traditions and mystical theology, showed particular affinity for certain aspects of the Gospel of Eve. Eastern Orthodox scholars pointed out that their tradition had always maintained reverence for Sophia as divine wisdom and had never completely suppressed feminine spiritual authority in the way that Western Christianity had done. These denominational responses revealed the complex theological challenges posed by the recovery of the gospel tradition. The ancient text forced contemporary Christians to confront uncomfortable questions about the historical development of their faith and the political factors that had shaped orthodox doctrine. The implications extended beyond Christianity to affect other religious traditions as well. Jewish scholars found elements of the gospel that corresponded to suppressed aspects of their own mystical traditions, while Islamic mystics discovered parallels to Sufi teachings about divine feminine wisdom. These interfaith connections suggested that the Gospel of Eve might represent part of a broader ancient wisdom tradition that had influenced multiple religious systems before being suppressed by orthodox authorities in each tradition. The recovery of the gospel thus opened possibilities for new forms of interfaith dialogue based on shared mystical heritage rather than doctrinal differences. Contemporary Gnostic churches attempted to revive the specific practices and beliefs described in the Gospel of Eve, creating new religious communities based on ancient principles of direct spiritual experience and feminine religious leadership. These groups face the challenge of maintaining authenticity to historical sources while adapting to modern legal and social contexts. The influence of the recovered gospel extended into popular culture through novels, films, and television programs that explored themes of hidden knowledge, suppressed wisdom, and alternative spirituality. These cultural productions helped to spread awareness of the ancient tradition, while often sensationalizing or distorting its actual content. Documentary filmmakers and journalists investigated the historical suppression of the gospel tradition, creating works that revealed the political and social forces that had shaped the development of Orthodox Christianity. These productions brought scholarly research to wider audiences while raising questions about the completeness and accuracy of conventional religious narratives. The digital age provided new platforms for preserving and disseminating the recovered gospel texts. Online communities formed around shared interest in the ancient tradition, creating virtual spaces where individuals could study the texts, share interpretations, and explore contemporary applications of ancient practices. These developments ensured that the Gospel of Eve could never again be completely suppressed in the way that medieval church authorities had once attempted. The text had survived its centuries of enforced silence to emerge into a world where information could be instantly shared across global networks beyond the control of any single institution. Yet, fundamental questions remained about the ultimate significance of the recovered tradition. Did the Gospel of Eve represent a superior form of spirituality that had been unjustly suppressed? Or were there legitimate reasons why ancient church authorities had viewed it as dangerous to spiritual and social welfare? The debate continued among scholars, theologians, and practitioners as they grappled with texts that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine revelation, religious authority, and spiritual development. The gospel had returned from its enforced exile to pose questions that contemporary society was still learning how to address. The manuscript fragments that had survived in the Egyptian desert carried more than just historical curiosity. They bore witness to an entire worldview that had once competed with Orthodox Christianity for the spiritual allegiance of the ancient world. The recovery of these texts marked not an end, but a beginning, opening new chapters in humanity's ongoing quest to understand the nature of divine knowledge and its accessibility to ordinary human consciousness. The story of the Gospel of Eve thus represented more than an archaeological discovery or a theological curiosity. It embodied fundamental questions about truth, authority, and the human capacity for direct spiritual experience that remained as relevant in the contemporary world as they had been in the ancient communities that first preserved these dangerous and transformative teachings. The dawn of the 21st century brought technologies that would have seemed miraculous to the ancient scribes who first penned the Gospel of Eve. Digital imaging techniques, satellite archaeology, and advanced chemical analysis opened new frontiers in the recovery of suppressed knowledge. Yet these same technologies also revealed the staggering scope of what had been permanently lost to the flames of orthodoxy. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted across former Byzantine territories identified dozens of buried libraries that had escaped historical detection. Beneath the foundations of medieval churches, archaeologists discovered vault after vault of deliberately concealed manuscripts, their contents carbonized by fires that had burned with suspicious uniformity across the empire during the 6th and 7th centuries. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't random destructions caused by war or natural disaster. They represented a coordinated campaign of intellectual annihilation that had targeted specific types of texts with surgical precision. Gospel manuscripts that deviated from canonical narratives, theological treatises that questioned ecclesiastical authority, and ritual manuals that described practices incompatible with Orthodox Christianity had all been systematically eliminated. Among the carbonized fragments recovered from these sites, spectrographic analysis revealed traces of texts that bore the unmistakable linguistic markers of the Gospel of Eve tradition. The very molecules of the destroyed manuscripts testified to the existence of a literary corpus far more extensive than scholars had previously imagined. The Gospel had not been a single text, but the cornerstone of an entire library of forbidden knowledge. These scientific revelations coincided with breakthroughs in artificial intelligence that allowed researchers to reconstruct destroyed texts from minimal surviving evidence. Machine learning algorithms, trained on patterns of ancient Greek and Coptic literature, could extrapolate entire passages from fragmentary remains with unprecedented accuracy. The technology that promised to democratize access to information was now recovering secrets that had been deliberately buried for millennia. The first complete reconstruction emerged from a laboratory in Geneva, where computer scientists had fed thousands of papyrus fragments into neural networks designed to recognize textual patterns. The algorithm identified connections between fragments scattered across multiple archaeological sites, revealing that pieces of the same manuscript had been deliberately separated and buried in different locations to prevent reconstruction. When the scattered fragments were digitally reunited, they formed a previously unknown section of the Gospel of Eve that described the cosmic consequences of her awakening to divine knowledge. According to this recovered passage, Eve's consumption of the forbidden fruit had triggered what the text called the Great Disruption, a fundamental alteration in the fabric of reality that had sent shockwaves through the celestial hierarchy. The passage described how Eve's achievement of gnosis had broken the demiurge's stranglehold on human consciousness, creating the first crack in the prison of material existence. Her awakening became a beacon that called to other divine sparks trapped in flesh, initiating a process of cosmic liberation that would eventually culminate in the complete overthrow of false divine authority. This theological concept explained why the gospel tradition had been considered so uniquely dangerous by church authorities. The text didn't merely offer an alternative interpretation of familiar stories. It proclaimed that human consciousness itself was a divine force capable of reshaping the fundamental structure of reality through the acquisition of forbidden knowledge. The implications were revolutionary. If the gospel was correct, then every human being possessed the potential to achieve the same cosmic awareness that Eve had attained. The acquisition of gnosis wasn't merely a personal spiritual achievement, but a political act that challenged the very foundations of the material world order. Modern quantum physicists studying the recovered texts found remarkable parallels between ancient Gnostic cosmology and contemporary theories about the nature of consciousness and reality. The Gospel's description of reality as a multi-layered construct maintained by observational consensus bore striking resemblance to interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggested consciousness played a fundamental role in determining the nature of physical existence. These scientific parallels lent unexpected credibility to theological claims that had been dismissed as ancient superstition. The possibility that consciousness could indeed affect the structure of reality through observation and intention suddenly seemed less like religious fantasy and more like cutting-edge physics. The Gospel of Eve might have preserved genuine insights about the nature of existence that were only now being rediscovered through empirical investigation. Neuroscientists studying the brain states of individuals who claimed to have experienced Eve-like revelations discovered unique patterns of neural activity that corresponded to descriptions found in the ancient texts. During these experiences, normal boundaries between different brain regions dissolved, creating states of consciousness that participants described as unity with cosmic intelligence. Brain scans revealed that these mystical states involved the simultaneous activation of neural networks that were normally mutually exclusive. The default mode network, associated with self-awareness and ego function, operated simultaneously with networks associated with transcendent experience and dissolution of personal boundaries. This neurological paradox created the subjective experience of being both individual and universal, finite and infinite, human and divine. As the fragments of digitized manuscripts continue to materialize on laboratory screens across the globe, one truth becomes inescapably clear. The Gospel of Eve was not merely suppressed because it challenged specific doctrines or threatened particular institutions. It was eliminated because it offered humanity something far more dangerous than alternative theology. It promised liberation from the fundamental structures that govern human consciousness itself. The ancient scribes who risked their lives to preserve these forbidden teachings understood what modern authorities still fear. Knowledge, once awakened, cannot be contained. The spark that Eve supposedly kindled in that primordial garden continues to burn in the deepest recesses of human awareness, waiting for the proper conditions to ignite into cosmic revelation. Today, as artificial intelligence reconstructs what human hatred sought to destroy, we stand at the threshold of a question that has haunted Western civilization for 2 millennia. Were the Church Fathers correct to suppress teachings they viewed as spiritually catastrophic? Or did they destroy humanity's greatest opportunity for divine transformation? The Gospel of Eve has returned from its enforced exile, carrying secrets that challenge everything we believe about the nature of reality, consciousness, and our place in the cosmic order. The choice that faced our first mother in Eden now confronts us all. Will we reach for the forbidden fruit of knowledge, knowing it may shatter the comfortable illusions that have sustained civilization for centuries? The answer lies not in ancient manuscripts, but in the courage of each individual to seek truth beyond the boundaries of sanctioned belief.